Lieutenant Blake Rourke got 2 inches from the man's face. Jaw-tight voice loud enough for every SEAL in that training yard to hear, and asked the question like it was a weapon. "What rank are you, asshole?" The man in the faded jeans didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't raise his voice. He just looked Rourke dead in the eyes and said, "No rank you need to worry about." The whole yard laughed. Rourke laughed loudest. Nobody knew, not Rourke, not the SEALs, not the captain. Standing 200 yards away, polishing his reputation, that those words had just started a clock. And when that clock ran out, 4 United States generals would walk past every uniformed man in that hangar and salute the guy in the old pickup truck. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. You are going to want to be here for every single part of this. The engine of Daniel Cross's 2003 Ford F-150 knocked once, then settled as he pulled into the visitor lot of Joint Maritime Warfare Center just after 7:40 on a cold Monday morning in November. The truck had 214,000 miles on it. The passenger seat had a juice box in the cup holder, a purple hair tie looped around the gear shift, and a worksheet on the floorboard that read in a child's careful handwriting, "My Hero." A presentation by Mia Cross, age 10. Daniel didn't notice any of that right now. He was watching the base. He sat behind the wheel for 90 seconds before he got out. Not because he was nervous. The men who knew Daniel Cross understood that when he went still like that, he wasn't resting. He was reading. Taking in the layout, the movement of personnel, the timing of gate rotations, the way junior sailors walked versus the way officers walked, whether the body language between them matched or contradicted what the official reports had said. The official reports said everything was fine. The body language said something different. He climbed out, clipped his visitor credential to the chest of his weathered jacket, and walked toward the main entrance with both hands loose at his sides. His phone buzzed before he reached the gate. He already knew who it was. "Hey, sweetheart." "Dad?" Mia's voice came through the speaker with the particular urgency of a 10-year-old who has decided that what she needs to say cannot wait. "You remembered right. My presentation is tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight." Mrs. Farrell moved it back an hour, which actually makes it better for you, I think, because now it's at 7 instead of 6, so... "Mia, you have more time to get back, but I just wanted to make sure, because last time you forgot, and I know you didn't really forget, but..." "Mia." "What?" "I'll be there." A pause. Then softer. "Promise." Daniel stopped walking. Let the cold morning air sit around him for 1 second. Thought about how small her voice sounded when she asked that. Thought about how she always asked that, how she always would. "Promise," he said. 7 o'clock, front row if I can get it. She laughed and it cut right through him the way it always did. "You can't sit in the front row, Dad. That's for the kids." "Maybe I'll stand in the front row." "That's so embarrassing." "That's my job." She laughed again, said goodbye, told him not to eat vending machine food for lunch, and hung up. Daniel put his phone in his jacket pocket and walked through the gate. The credentialing desk was staffed by a young petty officer who was maybe 22-23. The kid looked at Daniel's visitor badge, typed something into his computer, frowned slightly at whatever came back, typed something else, and then looked up with a carefully neutral expression. "Purpose of visit, sir." "Readiness review consultation," Daniel said. The kid typed that. Frowned again. "I don't see you on today's. Can I get a secondary contact name?" Captain Vance's office handled the access. More typing. Then a long pause. Then the kid picked up the phone, spoke quietly into it, listened and set it down. His expression had shifted, though he was clearly working to keep it professional. "You're cleared, Mr. Cross. Have a good morning, sir." Daniel thanked him and walked through. He already knew what had happened on the other end of that phone call. He'd been doing this long enough to recognize the particular pause that happened when someone pulled a record and found it wasn't what they expected. Too many restricted fields. Too many blank pages where a normal consultant's background would show contract history, clearance tiers, company affiliations. When a record had that many empty spaces, it meant one of two things. Either nothing was there, or something was there that most people were not cleared to see. Daniel had stopped caring which conclusion people reached. Both of them kept people from asking follow-up questions, and right now, the less attention he drew, the more clearly he could see what this place actually was versus what it was pretending to be. He spent the first hour and 15 minutes walking, not touring, not being escorted, just walking. He had the kind of easy, purposeful stride that didn't invite questions, not fast enough to look rushed, not slow enough to look lost. He held a plain manila folder under his arm and occasionally consulted it the way any consultant might. What he was actually doing was cataloging. The first thing he noticed was the paperwork, specifically the way certain personnel reacted to paperwork. A chief petty officer near the maintenance bay spent 8 minutes reviewing a single form, then set it down without signing it, then picked it up again and looked around before putting it in a different folder. Daniel wrote nothing down. He simply remembered. The second thing he noticed was the conversations that stopped when he walked past, not the normal pauses of privacy or security consciousness. These were different, the kind of stops that involved eye contact between two people who were mid-sentence, and then silence, and then overly casual resumption of something else entirely once the stranger had passed. The conversations of people who knew they were doing something that couldn't survive scrutiny. The third thing he noticed was Noah Bennett. He hadn't been briefed on Bennett specifically, but he recognized the type immediately. 24, maybe 25. Good posture, trained posture, not natural. Quick eyes that moved to exits and faces the way observant people's eyes did. And something else, a particular quality of suppressed alertness. Like a man who had information he didn't know what to do with. Daniel filed that away and kept walking. He heard the training yard before he reached it. Rourke's voice carried. That was the first thing to understand about Lieutenant Blake Rourke. His voice was a tool he had spent years sharpening. It projected authority without effort. It filled spaces. It made younger men want to be looking at him when they heard it, because the instinct said that someone speaking like that had something worth seeing. Daniel reached the chain-link boundary of the outdoor tactical training area and stopped. 12 operators were mid-exercise working a rope system drill over a simulated ship deck. The equipment was the right equipment. The execution was technically competent. And Rourke was moving through them like a current, sharp corrections immediate, demands a word here, a command there, keeping the pace just past comfortable. Daniel watched. Then, one of the operators, young, probably 3 or 4 months into his current assignment, mistimed a transition. Nothing catastrophic. A half-second hesitation that broke the team's rhythm on a handoff sequence. Rourke was on him before the echo died. Bennett. The name came out like a door slamming. That's the third time. The third time. What are we doing? What is this drill? Walk me through it, right now, out loud. Bennett straightened. Sir, from the beginning, Bennett. The whole sequence. Because apparently, we need to go back to basics. Sir, the primary transition requires louder. The primary transition requires the secondary operator to confirm load before. Louder, Bennett. You think everyone on your team can hear you. You think in a real environment with wind and rotors and active fire that voice is going to save anybody. Do it again, all of it, louder. Bennett did it again, louder. His face was controlled, but his hands were tight. Daniel watched. When the sequence ended, Rourke turned away without acknowledgement, which was itself a statement, as calculated as anything else he did, and called the next phase of the drill. That's when Daniel saw the harness. It took him 4 seconds. One glance at the primary rope system, one at the load-bearing attachment point on the outer frame, and he knew. The carabiner coupling on the secondary safety line was showing stress fracturing at the gate hinge. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But under dynamic load, a man's full weight plus the acceleration of a fast rope descent. It was a question of when, not if. He stepped forward to the boundary fence. That harness needs to be replaced. 12 operators stopped. Rourke turned slowly. He took in Daniel Cross the way a man takes stock of something he has already decided doesn't require serious consideration. Civilian clothes. Visitor badge. No insignia. The kind of jacket that came from a sporting goods store, not a military surplus shop. The faded jeans, the worn work boots, the old truck still visible in the parking lot. Rourke's assessment took about 3 seconds, and by the end of it, his posture had shifted into something that the young operators around him would recognize as a social performance. Controlled. Theatrical. The kind of authority that needed an audience. "Who the hell asked you?" he said. His tone was almost pleasant. That was the worst part of it, not the aggression, but the lightness. The certainty that this would cost him nothing. Daniel looked at the harness, then back at Rourke. "The coupling on the secondary safety line has stress fracturing at the gate. Under full dynamic load that fails. I'd estimate within 30 to 40 cycles at current use rate." Silence. Rourke let the silence breathe for a moment, the way men with an audience do when they want the audience to feel the size of what they're about to say. Then he walked toward the fence, slowly. Each step deliberate. He stopped 4 feet from Daniel with the chain link between them, and then he came right up to the fence until the metal touched his chest, and he looked at Daniel. The way you look at something small that has made the mistake of speaking. "You want to tell me," Rourke said quietly, loud enough that every man in the yard could hear him, "who you are and what gives you the idea that you get to walk up to my training area and start telling me how to run my drills?" "I'm not telling you how to run your drills," Daniel said. "I'm telling you that harness is going to fail. That harness was inspected." "When?" Rourke's jaw moved. "Last week." "Who signed off?" The jaw again, tighter. "That's not your concern." "It'll be someone's concern when Bennett goes down 3 stories on a fractured carabiner." At the sound of his name, Bennett's eyes moved from Rourke to the visitor at the fence. He said nothing. Rourke took 2 more steps until he was as close as the fence allowed, and then he looked at Daniel with the specific expression of a man who has spent years being told he was the most dangerous person in any room and had grown to believe it. "What rank are you, asshole?" The yard was completely silent. Daniel looked at him. Not up at him, they were roughly the same height. Not flinching back, not forward, just steady. The kind of steady that doesn't need to announce itself because it has never had a reason to doubt itself. "No rank you need to worry about," Daniel said. The laughter started at the back of the group and moved forward. It was the laughter of men who'd read the situation and understood the politics of it, who had learned in the particular social ecosystem of a SEAL team that laughing at what their lieutenant found amusing was a form of alignment. Not all of them found it funny, but all of them laughed. Rourke let the laughter run its course. Then he turned back to his operators. "New safety equipment gets logged by end of week," he said, which was not an immediate stand-down, which was not an inspection, which was not what Daniel had said was necessary, and Rourke said it loud enough to the yard to make it sound like a response to a concern rather than a decision to continue with the current equipment. One of the junior operators started. "We're done here," Rourke said. "Phase 2, let's go." The operators moved. Bennett looked at the visitor one more time before he turned back to the formation. Daniel stood at the fence. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out a small worn notebook with a black cover, clicked a pen, and wrote down the time. 8:43 a.m. Then he put the notebook away and walked back toward the main buildings. Petty Officer Noah Bennett found him an hour later. Not on purpose, not in any conspiratorial way, Bennett simply walked around the corner of the maintenance bay, heading toward the equipment storage room, and nearly collided with Daniel, who was standing at a wall-mounted inspection log with his hands clasped behind his back reading it. Bennett started to apologize and step around. "When was the last full safety audit on the rope systems in Training Area 4? Daniel asked without looking up from the log. Bennett stopped. "Sir, the harness, the whole rope system. When was the last complete audit?" Bennett looked at the door behind him, then at the log, then at Daniel. I'm not sure I should be." "You don't have to answer," Daniel said, still reading the log. His voice was even, patient, like a man who had time and knew it. "I'm going to find out anyway. It'll be in the records. but it's faster if someone who's been here tells me. A long pause. 6 months, Bennett said. Maybe 7. Daniel looked up from the log. And the equipment issue today, that specific harness, has it been flagged before? Bennett looked at the door again. This time he didn't look back right away. Daniel waited. Yeah, Bennett said finally. Twice. Both times it was written up. Both times it came back from Captain Vance's office with a note that the equipment met minimum operational standard. Who wrote it up? Chief Hartman wrote the first one. Senior Chief Murdoch wrote the second. What happened to their reports? The pause was longer this time. They came back with the note. Both of them were told that if they had concerns about readiness statistics, there was a process for that, and the process didn't involve holding up training exercises. Daniel nodded once. He wrote something in his notebook. Not fast, not performatively. Just a steady hand putting words on paper, the way a man does when he's building something. You should know, Daniel said, still writing, that anything you tell me isn't going to come back on you. I'm not compiling a list of names for Lieutenant Rourke. I don't know who you are, Bennett said. No, Daniel agreed. So how do I know you're telling the truth? Daniel closed the notebook, put it in his jacket. He looked at Bennett directly. You don't. You have to decide whether what's been happening here is worth the risk of trusting someone you just met, or whether it's safer to walk away and let it keep happening. He didn't push. He didn't lean in. He didn't make it a recruitment speech. He simply said it and then waited. Bennett looked at the floor, then at the log on the wall, then at something past both of them that only he could see. The helicopter crash, he said, 3 months ago. Daniel said nothing. The official report said mechanical failure, unexpected component fatigue. Bennett's voice was careful, quiet. But I was in the maintenance bay 6 days before that exercise. I heard Chief Hartman talking to one of his guys. He said they'd flagged an issue with the tail rotor assembly and been told to log it as within tolerance and clear the aircraft. The hallway was very quiet. Did you talk to anyone about that? Daniel asked. I tried. Bennett's jaw moved. Once. Junior guy doesn't exactly have a direct line to anyone who cares. The word that came back was that I was that junior personnel questioning senior maintenance decisions was a morale issue. And if I wanted to pursue it formally, I could, but I should understand that readiness assessments factored into assignment reviews. Daniel let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Petty Officer." Bennett blinked. For what I didn't tell you anything official. No, Daniel said. But you told me the truth. That's harder than people think. He started to walk away, then stopped. One more thing, he said without turning around. Start keeping copies, emails, maintenance logs, anything that crosses your desk that relates to equipment clearances. Don't share them with anyone yet. Don't do anything with them. Just keep them somewhere that isn't here. Bennett stared at his back. Why? Daniel turned his head just slightly. Because when this is over, the only thing that's going to matter is what the paper says. And right now, someone is working very hard to make sure the paper says something different than what happened. Then he walked away down the hall. Rourke started digging that afternoon. He didn't go to Vance. That would have required explaining why some civilian visitor had gotten under his skin, and Rourke was not in the habit of offering that kind of ammunition. He went to a friend in the administrative shop, a Lieutenant J.G., who owed him a favor, and asked for a background pull on Daniel Cross, listed as a defense consultation contractor visitor, access authorized through Captain Vance's office. 20 minutes later, the Lieutenant J.G. called back. You want the short version? He asked. Sure. There isn't one. The background is weird. Weird how, like there's a Navy service record there. The dates track he was definitely in. But the unit designations are all classified. The deployments, the locations are redacted. The commendations are there, but the citations are sealed. And then there's this section in the middle where his service date's just there, but there's no assignment. Just a code I don't recognize. Rourke frowned. What code? I don't know. It's not any standard classification I've seen. I called a buddy in records and he got quiet and said he'd call me back. and then he texted me and said he couldn't help with this one, and I should probably drop it. A pause. Rourke, you there? Yeah, Rourke said. Forward me what you have. He read through it twice that evening. Then he called an older Master Chief named Holloway, who had been in long enough to have seen almost everything, and was trusted precisely because he volunteered opinions only when he thought they mattered. What does it mean, Rourke asked, when someone's service record has this many restricted fields? Holloway was quiet for a moment. Where'd you get this? Background pull on a visitor today. Civilian. No uniform. Showed up in a beat-up truck watching training. Uh-huh. He had a visitor credential, said he was a consultant. Uh-huh. I'm trying to figure out who he actually is. Holloway made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Son, he said, when a record has that many blank pages, there are two things you don't do. You don't assume it means nothing, and you don't assume you have the clearance to find out what it means. So what do I do? You ask yourself whether you treated that man well today. A silence. I asked him what rank he was, Rourke said. Holloway made the sound again. This time it had something more in it, something that might have been pity. How'd that go? He asked. Rourke didn't answer. Listen to me, Holloway said. I've been in 26 years. I've seen men with records like this once, maybe twice. The kind where the blank pages aren't absence, they're presence. The kind where what's not written is more significant than what is. He paused. When someone's record looks like this, you don't laugh at them. You ask why they're blank. And if you already laughed, I'd be doing some serious thinking about who was in that yard today. Rourke stared at the redacted pages on his screen. He had a purple hair tie on his gear shift, he said. Holloway was quiet. And a juice box. I saw it when I walked past his truck in the lot. He's got a kid, Holloway said. Apparently. Another silence. What did he want? Holloway asked. He was looking at a harness on our rope system. Said it needed to be replaced. A very long pause. Did he write anything down? Holloway asked. Rourke thought about the notebook. The careful, unhurried way the man had taken it out. The steady hand. The time he'd written. 8:43 a.m. Yeah, Rourke said. Holloway exhaled slowly. Then I'd be thinking very carefully about what happened in your yard this morning, he said. And I wouldn't be making any more phone calls about this man's record. Captain Richard Vance heard about the visitor incident secondhand from his XO, who had heard it from the training coordinator, who had heard it from two different operators who'd been in the yard that morning. The retelling was mostly amused. Some civilian consultant tried to interrupt Rourke's drill. Rourke handled it. There were a few variations on the punchline. The version that reached Vance still had Rourke's question in it, what rank are you, and still had the laughter. Vance didn't laugh. He sat behind his desk after the XO left and thought about three things in sequence. The first was Daniel Cross's visitor authorization, which he had approved 11 days ago, based on a phone call from a Pentagon liaison whose exact office he hadn't fully parsed and hadn't asked about. The second was the helicopter crash from 3 months ago. The investigation. The report that had gone out with his signature on the summary findings. The third was the maintenance logs he'd been briefed on 6 weeks before the crash, which had contained a flagged item on the tail rotor assembly, which he had directed the maintenance chief to log as within operational tolerance, so that the exercise schedule could proceed without impacting the quarterly readiness report. He sat with those three things for a while. Then he called his administrative officer and told her to have the training records for the past 8 months reviewed for anything that might present documentation inconsistencies before Friday's joint readiness review. He used those exact words. Documentation inconsistencies. She said, yes, sir. He sat back in his chair and he told himself that the man in the faded jeans was a contractor who had stepped out of line and been put back in line, and that was the end of it. He almost believed it. Daniel ate lunch alone at a small table in the back of the base cafeteria. He had a cup of black coffee and a plate of food. He'd taken from the hotline. Nothing remarkable, nothing chosen with any particular care. And he sat with his back to the wall facing the room and he watched. He watched rank interact with rank. He watched who sat with whom. He watched who performed deference while harboring something else, who was genuinely afraid. He watched a junior technician choose a seat 3 tables away from a senior chief rather than the closer available seat. He watched 2 pilots laugh loudly at something said by a commander who was less than 2 years their senior. He watched 3 enlisted personnel have what appeared to be a genuinely comfortable low-stakes conversation, the only group in the entire cafeteria that looked like they were actually just eating lunch. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Not Mia this time. A message from a number he recognized but didn't have saved in his contacts from a man who worked in an office on the 4th floor of a building in Washington, whose name he wasn't going to think in a room with this many people. The message read, "Assessment timeline moved. Review convenes, Friday not Monday. Vance's team will know by tomorrow." Daniel set his phone face down on the table. So Vance had less time than he thought. Which meant the records would be moved faster than anticipated. Which meant any documentation that was going to disappear would disappear in the next 48 hours. He looked at his coffee. He thought about Mia's presentation. He thought about the juice box in the passenger seat of his truck. He thought about the harness at 8:43 in the morning, and Bennett's careful voice saying twice both times, and the weight of everything that had been filed and filed again and ignored again. All the small refused warnings that had accumulated the way small debts do invisibly, until the moment they weren't invisible anymore. He thought about the helicopter. 2 men who had been injured. 2 families who had received explanations that were technically consistent with the investigation's findings and were not in any meaningful sense true. He picked up his coffee. He took out his notebook. He wrote, "Documentation review, initiated 48 AHR window. Bennett secondary source. Physical evidence location TBD. Harness secure before Friday." He put the notebook away. He finished his coffee. He threw away his tray, nodded to the cashier on his way out, and walked back out into the cold November afternoon. He had work to do. And he had promised Mia he'd be home by 7. He would keep that promise. He always kept that promise. But first, he was going to find out exactly how deep the damage went, and whether anyone on this base still had the courage to tell the truth before someone else got hurt. The base settled into its afternoon rhythm, the way military installations always do, not quietly but with a particular kind of organized noise that had its own cadence, its own predictable patterns. Vehicles moved on schedule. Personnel rotated on schedule. Even the wind coming off the coast seemed to understand that Joint Maritime Warfare Center ran on a timetable. Daniel Cross did not run on their timetable. He was back in the maintenance bay at 1:15 p.m., and he was reading a wall, not metaphorically. There was a physical inspection board mounted near the secondary equipment storage, a large corkboard system with color-coded tags representing the status of training gear across all active exercise areas. Green meant cleared. Yellow meant flagged for review. Red meant stand down. The board was almost entirely green. Daniel stood in front of it with his coffee cup and his plain face and his visitor badge, and he counted. 47 items. 43 green. 3 yellow, all logged within the past 4 days. 1 read a navigation system from an aviation trainer that had been pulled 2 weeks ago. He took out his notebook and wrote down the numbers. Then he wrote something else. Previous audit. What did this board look like before the helicopter crash? He already knew the answer wasn't going to be 43 green tags. He already knew that because Noah Bennett had told him about the flagged tail rotor assembly. He already knew that because Chief Hartman had written up the rope harness twice and been turned back twice. He already knew that because men who were afraid to speak in a hallway did not become afraid overnight. They became afraid over time, gradually. The way water wears stone, not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently, until one day the stone is just gone, and you're standing in a hole you don't remember digging. He turned away from the board. Senior Chief Marcus Murdoch was standing 6 feet behind him. Daniel hadn't heard him come in. That was notable because Daniel Cross had spent enough years in enough places where not hearing someone approach had consequences. And his instincts on that particular point did not go quiet just because he was wearing civilian clothes and carrying a coffee cup in a maintenance bay in North Carolina. Murdoch was in his mid-40s, thick through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He looked at Daniel with an expression that was not hostile and not welcoming. It was measuring. The careful look of a man deciding whether something was worth his time. "You're the consultant," Murdoch said. "Not a question." "Daniel Cross," Daniel said. Murdoch looked at this board, then at the notebook, then back at Daniel. "You wrote up the harness this morning." "I noted it," Daniel said. Lieutenant Rourke noted that it would be addressed by end of week. Something moved across Murdoch's face. Not quite a smile. Closer to the expression you make when someone confirms a thing you already knew, but were hoping not to. "I wrote that harness up 6 weeks ago," Murdoch said. "I know," Daniel said. Murdoch was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that?" "Because it wasn't the first time, and it wasn't the only thing." Daniel looked at the board again. "How many of those green tags should be yellow right now?" A very long pause. Murdoch looked at the door, then at the board. He was doing the calculation that men in his position always had to do, the one where you weighed what you knew against what it cost to say it, and tried to decide if the scale had finally tipped far enough. "I'm not here to get anyone in trouble," Daniel said quietly. "I'm here because 2 men went down in a helicopter 3 months ago, and their families were told it was component fatigue. I want to know if that's true." Murdoch said nothing. "You know whether it's true," Daniel said. Still nothing. "Senior Chief." Daniel's voice didn't harden. It stayed exactly the same level, patient, with no performance in it at all. "I'm going to find out. The only question is whether I find out from the documents or from the people who are actually here. The documents are already being altered. I watched them start this morning." Murdoch's jaw tightened. "How do you know they're being altered?" "Because someone told Captain Vance that the review timeline moved up, and by now Vance has told someone to clean the records, and that someone is in an office right now deciding which files need to look different by Friday." Daniel paused. "I've seen it before. The pattern is always the same. The only thing that ever changes it is someone with first-hand knowledge, deciding the truth matters more than the consequences." Murdoch stared at the green board for a long moment. "The tail rotor assembly," he said finally. "It wasn't component fatigue. We had a documented wear indicator that was outside spec. Not catastrophically outside, but outside. I brought it to Chief Hartman. Hartman brought it to the training officer. The training officer went to Vance's XO." He stopped. "The exercise was on the quarterly readiness calendar. Moving it would have dropped us below the 95% threshold for the report cycle." Daniel wrote nothing. He just listened. The XO came back and said the wear reading was within acceptable operational tolerance given the flight hours and mission profile. "I asked him who made that determination. He said it had been reviewed." Murdoch's voice had gone very flat. "I asked reviewed by whom. He said that was above my level." "Did you sign off on the aircraft?" Daniel asked. "No." The word came out hard and clean. "I logged my objection. I wrote it in the maintenance record with my name and the date and exactly what I'd found. 3 days later, when I went back to pull that record for my files, the page had been replaced. The new entry showed the assembly cleared to standard. My name wasn't on it." The maintenance bay was completely quiet. "That entry," Daniel said. "The replacement. Do you know who wrote it?" Murdoch looked at him directly. "I know who had the access and the authority to write it. I can't prove it with what I have in my hands right now." "But you kept records," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Murdoch held his gaze for 3 full seconds. "I've been in this Navy for 22 years, he said. "I've seen what happens when you don't." He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it without extending it, like a man deciding at the last possible moment whether he was actually going to do this. "This is a personal log," he said. "Dates, times, entries, exactly what I observed and what was said to me. I wrote it the day after the crash." He paused. "I've been carrying it around for 3 months, not knowing what to do with it. Daniel took it carefully. He unfolded it, read through it once, folded it back. "I'll need your formal statement," he said. Murdoch nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had made a decision and was done second-guessing it. "There's one more thing," Murdoch said. "The boy Bennett. He came to me about 2 months ago. He'd seen something in the maintenance logs that concerned him, discrepancies between the raw equipment data and the summarized reports going up the chain. I told him to be careful." He paused, and something moved across his face that was close to regret. "I should have told him more than that." "He's all right," Daniel said. Murdoch looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because I talked to him this morning, and he's still asking questions." Daniel put the folded paper in his notebook. "That's how you know someone is all right." He thanked Murdoch, and he walked back out into the afternoon. It was 2:07 p.m. He had less than 48 hours, and somewhere in this base someone was shredding paper. The thought moved through him without panic. That was one of the things that years of operating in high-stakes environments gave you: not the absence of urgency, but the ability to carry urgency without letting it rewrite your judgment. He knew what the pressure to move fast could cost. He'd seen careful men make destructive mistakes because they'd let the clock turn into fear, and fear into shortcuts, and shortcuts into the kind of error that couldn't be walked back. So he did not run. He walked to his truck, got in, drove to a gas station 3 miles outside the base gate, and called a number he hadn't called in 6 weeks. The woman who answered was named Margaret Chen, and her official title was Senior Staff Analyst, Joint Oversight Review. But Daniel had known her for 11 years, and she was one of the 4 people on the planet he trusted without qualification. "Tell me you have something," she said before he finished saying hello. 3 sources. 1 written log firsthand. 1 verbal account firsthand, no documentation yet. 1 secondary witness who has been copying records. He heard her exhale. Enough for the review. Enough to open it. Not enough to close it. He looked at the rearview mirror out of habit. Empty parking lot. "Vance started cleaning the records this morning. We have maybe 36 hours before the documentation trail goes cold. Can you secure the originals?" "Working on it. What do you need from this end?" "I need the review board assembled and ready to convene on Friday, not Monday. I need a records hold placed on Vance's command files official, with authorization from the commission, so it can't be overridden locally. And I need someone to reach out to the families." A pause. "The Crash families. They deserve to know the investigation is being reopened before they read about it somewhere else." Chen was quiet for a moment. "You know this is going to blow back hard on some senior people." Yeah, Daniel said. "Vance has connections on the Hill." "I know. The Commission's authority covers this, but if Vance pushes back through his contacts..." "Margaret." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "2 men are permanently injured. Their families were told a lie. How many connections does that cancel out?" Silence. "I'll have the hold in place by 0600 tomorrow," she said. "Thank you." He hung up. Sat in the truck for a moment. Then he drove back to the base. It was 2:41 p.m. He had 5 hours and 19 minutes before Mia's presentation. He was going to make it. But first, Blake Rourke was waiting for him in the corridor outside the training analysis office, and the expression on Rourke's face had changed significantly since that morning in the yard. The theatrical confidence was still there. You couldn't strip that from Rourke without surgery, but underneath it, something else had moved in. A kind of watchfulness that hadn't been visible at 8:43 a.m. Rourke had made some phone calls. He'd gotten some answers he hadn't expected. And now he was standing in the corridor with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he was waiting for the man he had laughed at 4 hours ago. "Mr. Cross," he said. Daniel stopped. "Lieutenant, you want to tell me what you're actually doing here?" "I thought I explained this morning. Readiness review consultation. I made some calls about you." "I know," Daniel said. That stopped Rourke. "You know, when someone runs a background check on a visitor and comes back confused, the person who ran it usually tells someone. Word moves." Daniel's voice had nothing combative in it. He spoke the way you speak to someone you are not afraid of and do not particularly enjoy making uncomfortable. What did you find out? Rourke's jaw worked. Not much. That's the point. Your record is like reading a book where someone cut out every other page. Yes. Why? Because some of what's in those pages required a clearance level you don't have, and the people who set up those access controls made a determination about what was appropriate to share with whom. Daniel paused. It's not personal, Lieutenant. Rourke looked at him for a long moment. Who are you? I told you this morning. I'm no rank you need to worry about. You're worrying me, Rourke said. And the way he said it without the performance, without the audience, was the most honest thing Daniel had heard from him all day. Daniel looked at him steadily. That harness you kept in service this morning. If Bennett had gone down on it, what would have happened to his family? The question landed differently than Rourke expected. Daniel could see it, the slight change in posture, the thing that moved behind the eyes. Equipment meets operational standard, Rourke said. Does it? The review cycle. I talked to Senior Chief Murdoch this afternoon, Daniel said. Silence. Rourke's arms, which had been crossed, came down. It was a small movement, but it was telling. Murdoch doesn't. He wrote that harness up 6 weeks ago. And another piece of equipment 2 months before that. And a concern about the helicopter before the crash. Daniel said all of it quietly. No accusation in his voice. Just facts delivered at a pace that allowed each one to land. Both reports came back cleared. His maintenance log entry was replaced. Rourke was very still. I know you didn't do that, Daniel said. I know you're not the one who changed the records. I know you benefited from a culture that you didn't create. He paused. But you kept a damaged harness in service this morning because you wanted the drill to continue, and you mocked a safety concern in front of your team, and now every young operator in that yard has learned something from watching you do it. He let that sit. That part is on you. Rourke said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not broken, not apologetic, but different in the way that something is different when a crack appears in it. What happens on Friday? The review board convenes, Daniel said. I present my findings. The commission makes determinations based on what the evidence shows. And if the evidence has been cleaned, it hasn't all been cleaned, Daniel said. That's the thing about trying to erase a truth that more than one person knows. You can pull the paper. You can't pull the memory. Rourke looked at him. The watchfulness in his face had become something else, something more complicated, harder to name. He looked like a man beginning to understand that the room he'd been standing in was larger than he'd thought. What do you want from me? Rourke said. Nothing right now, Daniel said. You have until Friday to think about what kind of officer you want to be in that room. He moved to step past him, then stopped. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, you're a good operator. I've been watching your team work all day. You're skilled and you're disciplined and your people execute under pressure. None of that goes away. He met Rourke's eyes. The question is whether those qualities belong to the institution or to you. Whether you're good because you've been shaped to project competence for the metrics, or whether you actually believe the mission matters, which means the people doing it have to come home. He walked away. Behind him, he heard Rourke not move for a long moment. Then footsteps not following, but walking in the opposite direction, which was its own kind of answer. It was 3:18 p.m. Daniel went back to work. He spent the next 90 minutes in quiet, methodical motion through the base, not drawing attention, not rushing, not doing anything that looked different from a consultant reviewing documentation. He photographed 3 physical inspection logs with his phone, not covertly, but openly. The way a man with authorization photographs things as part of a legitimate review. He spoke to 2 more maintenance personnel, brief conversations, neutral in framing, designed not to lead, but to listen. Both of them separately corroborated pieces of what Murdoch had told him. Both of them separately mentioned the phrase readiness statistics, the way people mention a weather system, as something that had arrived without their consent and now governed everything around them. At 4:50 p.m., Noah Bennett found him. He was in the secondary documentation room reviewing a binder of training cycle reports. when the door opened and Bennett slipped in with the particular energy of a young man who has been working up to something for hours and has finally arrived at the moment where he either does it or he doesn't. He was carrying a flash drive. He set it on the table in front of Daniel without a word. Daniel looked at it, looked at Bennett. "How much?" he asked. Bennett's voice was steady, though it cost him something to make it that way. 7 months of maintenance logs. Copies I made from the system before they started restricting my access 3 weeks ago. Emails mostly internal, some with attachments. And a folder of training incident reports that I found in the old archive system that don't match the official summary documents that went up the chain. Daniel picked up the drive. "When did you start copying?" 4 months ago, Bennett said. "Right after the crash. I didn't know what I was going to do with any of it. I knew something wasn't right. I knew what I'd heard before the crash. And after the crash, when the report came out and it said mechanical failure and component fatigue, I kept thinking that's not what Chief Hartman said in that maintenance bay." His jaw was tight. These guys got hurt, 2 of them, and they were told something that wasn't true about why it happened. And their families were told something that wasn't true. He paused. I couldn't unknow that. Daniel turned the drive in his hand. He thought about what it had cost this kid, 24 years old, junior rank, no protection, no certainty that anyone on the other side of whatever he was walking toward was actually going to catch him to walk into this room and put this on the table. "You understand," Daniel said carefully, "that this constitutes a formal disclosure, that it goes into the record, that I can't promise you it doesn't have professional consequences." "I know," Bennett said. "And you're sure?" "I've been sure for 4 months," Bennett said. "I've just been scared for 4 months. Those are different things." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "They are." He put the drive in his jacket pocket. "What happens now?" Bennett asked. "Now you go about your evening normally. Don't alter anything. Don't access anything. Don't discuss this with anyone. Not Murdoch. Not anyone you trust. Not anyone at all until after Friday." Daniel closed the binder in front of him. "You've been brave enough for today. Let me carry it from here." Bennett nodded. He started for the door, then stopped. "Mr. Cross," he said. "Yeah. Who are you?" The question was simpler than Rourke's version. There was no challenge in it, just need. The need of a young man who has risked something significant and wants to know if it was in the hands of someone real. Daniel considered the question. "I'm someone who was sent here because people in Washington got an anonymous report saying that what happened to those 2 servicemen wasn't an accident, and they needed to know if that was true." He paused. "I'm someone whose daughter has a presentation tonight at 7 o'clock that I am not going to miss." He met Bennett's eyes. "And I'm someone who has been in situations before where junior personnel were the only ones with the courage to say what was actually happening. And I've never forgotten that." Bennett absorbed that. Then he nodded a different nod than the professional one, something more personal. He left. Daniel sat with the flash drive in his pocket and the binder in front of him and the quiet of the documentation room around him. It was 5:07 p.m. He had until Friday. He had 3 first-hand sources, a physical log, 7 months of copied documents, and the beginning of a records hold that would go into effect at 0600 the next morning. He also had 53 minutes to get off this base drive to Wilmington, change his shirt, find parking, and walk into a school gymnasium in time to watch his daughter stand in front of a room of people and present a project she had been working on for 2 weeks. He packed up the binder, returned it to its shelf, not hidden, not removed, simply returned because he didn't need to take it when he had what it contained. He straightened the chair. He checked the table to make sure he'd left nothing. Then he walked out of the documentation room, down the corridor, through the main building, and out into the cold November late afternoon. His truck was where he'd left it. The juice box was still in the cup holder. The purple hair tie was still looped around the gear shift. Mia's worksheet was still on this floorboard. He started the engine, and the knock came and settled, and he pulled out of the visitor lot and headed for the gate. The guard at the gate was the same young petty officer from the morning. He looked at Daniel's badge as he processed the exit, and then looked up with something in his expression that was very slightly different from the professional neutrality of 7:40 a.m. Daniel didn't know what had circulated through the base about the morning's incident in the yard. He imagined something had. Things like that always did. "Have a good evening, Mr. Cross," the kid said. "You too, petty officer," Daniel said. He drove through the gate and onto the highway, and for a few miles, he didn't think about the flash drive in his pocket or the records hold going into effect at 0600 or what Captain Vance was doing right now in his office, or what Blake Rourke was doing wherever Rourke had gone after their corridor conversation. He thought about purple construction paper and a 10-year-old's careful handwriting. He thought about a little girl who had told him the front row was for kids. He pressed the accelerator and drove. He was going to be there. He always was. But back at the base in an office on the second floor of the administrative building, Captain Richard Vance was staring at a memo that had just come through on a channel. He hadn't expected from an authorization level. He couldn't override informing him that effective 0600, the following morning, all training records, maintenance logs, and administrative documentation from the past 12 months at Joint Maritime Warfare Center would be subject to a federal records hold, pending a classified Joint Commission review. He read it 3 times. Then he picked up his phone and tried to call his contact on the Hill. It went to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. He set the phone down on his desk and stared at the wall. And somewhere in the paperwork on his desk, under the memo he'd just read, was a requisition form from the maintenance shop requesting replacement of a secondary safety harness in Training Area 4. It had been sitting there for 6 weeks. It still had his signature pending. He hadn't signed it. Tonight, staring at that wall, he finally understood that the quiet man in the faded jeans who had driven an old pickup truck through his gate that morning had not come to his base as a visitor. He had come as a reckoning. And the clock that had started ticking at 8:43 a.m. was still running. Mia's presentation was on a Tuesday night, which meant the gymnasium smelled like industrial cleaner and old sneakers, which meant the folding chairs had been set up in crooked rows by 4th graders who had wildly different opinions about what constituted a straight line, which meant Daniel Cross arrived at 6:52 p.m. with 8 minutes to spare, still wearing his dark jacket from the base, and found a seat 3 rows back on the left side, because the front row was in fact occupied by children, and his daughter had been entirely correct about that. He'd changed his shirt in the truck at a red light. He was not going to think about that. The gymnasium filled up the way. School gymnasiums always do. Parents with phones out, before anything had actually started, younger siblings running between the chairs until a teacher used the specific voice that stopped them. A few grandparents in the very back who had arrived early and claimed the seats with the best view and the most back support. Daniel said hello to the couple next to him, a pair of parents whose daughter was apparently doing a project on Harriet Tubman, and they talked for 4 minutes about nothing in particular. And the whole time, Daniel felt the flash drive in his jacket pocket like a stone, and he did not think about it, and he watched the door through which the students would enter. Mia came through at third. She was carrying a poster board against her chest, facing and hiding it, and she was walking with the particular kind of careful dignity that 10-year-olds deploy when they are terrified and determined not to show it. She scanned the audience immediately the way Daniel had taught her without realizing he was teaching her quick, systematic left to right. And when she found him, she broke into a smile that she immediately tried to suppress because she was being professional. And then the smile won, and she gave a tiny wave with the hand that wasn't holding the poster board. Daniel raised his hand back. She found her seat with the other students. He let out a breath he hadn't entirely known he was holding. For the next 40 minutes, he did not think about Blake Rourke. He did not think about the records hold going into effect at 0600. He did not think about what Vance was doing in his office, or what Margaret Chen was navigating in Washington, or what the flash drive contained, or what Friday would look like. He watched 8 children present projects about their heroes. He watched a boy nearly drop his poster board and catch it at the last second. He watched a girl forget her opening line, and then remember it and deliver the rest flawlessly. He watched all of it with the particular quality of attention he gave Mia's life. Total patient, genuinely interested, because this was the work that mattered, and he had understood that clearly for 5 years, ever since the morning. He had stood in a hospital corridor and been told that his wife was gone, and had driven home to tell a 5-year-old girl that her mother wasn't coming back, and had understood in that moment what the rest of his life was actually for. Then Mia stood up. She walked to the front with her poster board still facing in, and she set it on the easel the teacher had prepared, and she turned to face the audience, and she took one breath, and she began. "My hero," she said in a clear, steady voice that made something tighten in Daniel's chest, "is someone who has never been on television. He doesn't have a trophy. He doesn't have a cape." She paused. "He has a 2003 Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles on it, and he makes really bad pancakes, and he comes to every single one of my games even when it's raining." A soft wave of laughter from the parents. Mia turned the poster board around. It had a photograph of Daniel in the center. Not in uniform. Not at any ceremony or formal occasion. It was a picture taken at the kitchen table on an ordinary Sunday morning, where he was helping her with a math worksheet, leaning over her shoulder with a pencil, and they were both laughing at something, and Daniel had had absolutely no idea anyone had taken it. He stared at it. "My dad fixes my bike when it breaks," Mia said. "He makes my lunch every day, even though he's not a very good cook. He knows every rule of baseball because he coaches my team, but he never gets mad when we lose." She looked at this poster, then at the audience. "He comes to parent meetings even when he's tired. He sits with me when I have nightmares. He always, always, always says goodnight." She paused. "I don't know everything my dad did before. He doesn't talk about it very much. But I know that whatever it was, he decided I was more important. And I think that's what a hero does. They decide what matters most. And then they show up for it. Every single day." The gymnasium was very quiet. Then the parents started clapping, and Daniel was clapping with them, and he was looking at that photograph on the poster board, the Sunday morning kitchen, the math worksheet, the two of them laughing, and he was thinking about rank, about what it meant, about what it measured, and what it could not. He'd held ranks that most people in that gymnasium would not have been cleared to know about. He had operated in places and circumstances that would never appear on any record available to any of them. He had been addressed by his position in rooms where the address itself was classified. He had been saluted by men of extraordinary distinction, and sitting in a crooked folding chair in a school gymnasium that smelled like industrial cleaner, watching his 10-year-old daughter tell a room full of strangers that he made bad pancakes and always said goodnight. Daniel Cross understood with the kind of clarity that doesn't argue with itself that she had just described the highest rank he had ever held. He got to her as she came off the small stage, and she looked up at him with the expression of someone waiting for a verdict. "The pancakes are not that bad," he said. She grinned. "They kind of are. Your mother would have agreed with you." Her grin softened into something quieter. "I know," she said. Then, "Was it okay?" He crouched down to her level, which he still did, even though she was getting old enough that she didn't require it, because he wanted to be at her eye level when it mattered. "It was perfect," he said. Every word. She leaned into him briefly, the way she did when she was tired of performing composure, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in the gymnasium for a moment, before she straightened back up because her friend Kayla was waving from across the room. He drove her home. She talked the whole way about Kayla's project, and whether the judges would pick a winner, and what she wanted for dinner. He listened to all of it, and answered all of it, and pulled into the driveway at 8:23 p.m., feeling more grounded than he had in 3 days. He put her to bed at 9:30. She asked him to tell her one thing about his day. He thought for a moment. "I met a young man today who was afraid to do the right thing, and then did it anyway," he said. "That was the best part." She considered this. "That's good," she decided with the authority of someone for whom moral clarity was still uncomplicated, and fell asleep inside of 7 minutes. Daniel sat at the kitchen table until midnight. He had his notebook open, a cup of coffee going cold beside it, and the flash drive on the table next to both of them. He wasn't reviewing the drive. He wouldn't put it in his own computer. He was working through his handwritten notes, building the shape of the narrative, the chain of decisions and their consequences, the names and dates and connections that he would present to the commission on Friday. The pattern was clear now. Not messy, not ambiguous, not the product of individual bad actors operating in isolation. It was systemic. It was the shape that institutions take when the metrics they use to measure success stop corresponding to the things that actually matter. 98% operational readiness sounds like excellence, and it was excellence on paper in the report cycles and the briefings that went up the chain to people who needed the numbers to be good. But the number had become the thing itself instead of representing the thing. And everything that threatened the number had been pushed down, filed away, reclassified, ignored until the number stayed clean, while the reality it was supposed to reflect deteriorated underneath it. The helicopter was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a machine that had been optimized to report well rather than function well. He wrote for 2 more hours. Then he closed the notebook, washed his coffee cup, and went to sleep. He was back at the base by 7:15 a.m. The atmosphere had changed overnight. He felt it at the gate. The young petty officer who processed his entry was professionally composed, but there was something careful in his manner. Something that said he had been briefed that morning on things that made this particular visitor's arrival significant in ways he was not authorized to fully understand. The gate log process took 4 minutes instead of 2. That wasn't carelessness. That was documentation. Someone had told him to document everything. Vance had told someone to document everything. Daniel walked through the gate and thought good. A man who starts documenting the arrival of his reviewer has already made his first confession. He was in the corridor outside the operations wing at 7:31 a.m. when he heard the raised voices from inside. Not a briefing, not a training exercise. 2 voices, private and pressured, coming through the door of an office that had been someone's idea of a meeting room. Cramped, fluorescent. Lit, the kind of space where difficult conversations happened because it was the closest available room with a door that closed. He didn't stop at the door. He kept walking. But he heard enough. Vance's voice, low and controlled and hard. "I need you to understand the position this puts the command in." And another voice, older, rougher. The voice of a man who had stopped being careful, that said, "Sir, with respect, I've been understanding the position for 8 months. I've been understanding it every time someone brought me a safety report, and I was told to make it go away." Daniel stopped 12 feet past the door. The second voice was Chief Petty Officer Dale Hartman. He stood and listened for 4 more seconds. He heard Vance say something sharp and clipped that he couldn't make out. He heard Hartman say clearly, "Then I'll put it in writing, sir. I'll put all of it in writing." Daniel kept walking. At 7:44 a.m. Hartman came out of the corridor door behind him, and Daniel turned and looked at him, and Hartman looked back, and something passed between them that required no words. The recognition between 2 men who understood exactly what was happening and had each made their choice about which side of it to stand on. "Senior Chief mentioned your name," Hartman said. "He spoke highly of you," Daniel said. Hartman laughed once, a short and humorless sound. "I've been getting everyone else hurt trying to protect myself," he said. "I'm done with that." "There will be a formal interview," Daniel said. "Today if you're available. Everything on the record." "I'm available," Hartman said. They walked to a room at the far end of the building, and Daniel recorded everything Hartman said. And Hartman said a great deal, and none of it was comfortable, and all of it was true. It was 9:20 a.m. when they finished, which was 7 minutes before Blake Rourke walked into the exercise planning bay and found Daniel at the main briefing table, reviewing a stack of training cycle documents with 2 junior analysts who had been seconded to the review and did something that nobody in the bay expected. He sat down, not confrontationally, not with the theatrical weight he'd carried into the training yard 2 days ago. He pulled out a chair across the table from Daniel and sat down, the way a man sits when he's done performing and has arrived at something real. The 2 analysts looked at each other. "Give us a few minutes," Daniel said without looking up from the documents. They left. Rourke put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Daniel. "I talked to Master Chief Holloway last night," he said. "I know who he is," Daniel said. "He told me some things about the kind of record you have, not specifics. He doesn't know the specifics either, just the shape of it." He paused. "He told me that the last time he saw a record with that structure, It belonged to someone who had been in places and done things that most of the people at this installation would not have survived. Daniel said nothing. "I've been thinking," Rourke said, "about what it means that I talked to you the way I talked to you yesterday morning, and the day before." "What did you land on?" Rourke was quiet for a moment. "That it would have been wrong even if you were exactly who you looked like. A consultant, a contractor, whoever." He looked at his hands. "I ask junior sailors what rank they are when I want to establish that they don't have the standing to challenge me. I've been doing that a long time. I didn't think of it as a problem. I thought of it as authority." He paused. "It isn't authority. It's a way of deciding in advance who deserves to be heard." The planning bay was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked. "Because I think I'm going to be in a room on Friday with a lot of people trying to explain themselves," Rourke said. "And I want to be able to say something true in that room, something that isn't about protecting myself." His jaw was tight. "And I can't do that if I haven't said it to you first." Daniel looked at him directly. For the first time since Monday morning in the yard, he looked at Blake Rourke without any professional filter on the look, no assessment, no distance, no calculation. Just one man looking at another. "The harness," Daniel said. "Right now, this morning, pull it from service." Rourke looked at him. "Don't wait for Friday. Don't wait for the review. Don't wait for authorization you don't need. That harness does not go back on a training system today." Daniel's voice was not hard. It was simply final. "You have the authority to make that call as a training officer. Use it." A pause. Then Rourke nodded. He stood, and for a moment, he just stood there. And then he said something that Daniel hadn't expected. "My team respects you. The operators who were in the yard Monday. They've been talking about it." He met Daniel's eyes. "They don't know who you are either, but they know what happened, and they respect it." Then he left. Daniel sat alone in the planning bay for 90 seconds. He thought about what Rourke had just. He thought about a young lieutenant who had been shaped by years of an institution rewarding aggression and who was now sitting in the difficult space between what he'd been taught to be and what he was beginning to understand he could choose to be. That wasn't nothing. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of thing that mattered more in the long run than any single investigation. I went back to work. By 11:00 a.m., the records hold was fully in place, and Vance's administrative officer had called the Commission's Washington office 3 times. The calls were logged. The Commission did not return them. That was by design. At 11:47 a.m., Daniel received a text from Margaret Chen. "Convoy departs Andrews. Tomorrow night arrives your location, 0700 Friday. Confirmed 4 principals. Records team follows separately. 4 principals." He put his phone away. At 12:30 p.m. Captain Vance appeared in the doorway of the planning bay, with his XO behind him and the expression of a man who has decided that aggressive forward motion is still his best option. "Mr. Cross," Vance said, "I think we should have a conversation." "Of course," Daniel said. He closed the folder in front of him and folded his hands on the table. Vance came in and sat across from him without invitation, which told Daniel something. The XO hovered near the door, which told him something else. "I want to understand the scope of what's being reviewed," Vance said. "As commanding officer of this installation, I believe I'm entitled to." "Captain," Daniel said. His voice was not unkind, but it was precisely clear. "The Commission's authority under the Joint Oversight Charter supersedes local command review. You've received the relevant documentation. What specifically would you like to clarify?" Vance's composure held, but it held the way ice holds in late March by habit rather than structural integrity. "I want to know what allegations are being investigated." "The Commission doesn't characterize its inquiry as allegation-based at this stage," Daniel said. "We're conducting a readiness and safety review. The scope is defined in the charter documents you received." "The helicopter crash," Vance said flatly, "is one element," Daniel said. "The report on that crash was completed by qualified investigators and signed off through the appropriate chain." "Yes," Daniel said. "It was." The flatness of that confirmation sat between them for a moment. Vance understood it. His jaw moved. I have an excellent readiness record, he said. This command has consistently exceeded performance benchmarks across every... Captain. Daniel leaned forward slightly, not threateningly, just closing the distance enough to make the conversation real. I've read your readiness reports. They're impressive. I'm sure they looked excellent from Washington. He paused. I've also read Senior Chief Murdoch's personal log, and Chief Hartman's formal statement, which he gave this morning. And I've reviewed 7 months of maintenance documentation that suggests the relationship between your readiness numbers and actual equipment condition has been creative. The word landed exactly as he'd intended it to. Vance's face did something complicated. I'd recommend, Daniel said, still without cruelty, that you speak with your legal representative before Friday. That's not a threat. It's practical advice. Are you telling me to lawyer up? Vance said. I'm telling you that the review convenes Friday morning at 0800, that 4 commission principals will be present, and that your cooperation at that stage will be noted in the findings. He held Vance's gaze, as will its absence. Vance stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Daniel with the expression of a man who had been very powerful in a very specific world for a very long time, and who was beginning to understand that the walls of that world did not extend as far as he had believed. We'll see what Friday looks like, Vance said. Yes, Daniel agreed. We will. Vance left. The XO followed without making eye contact. Daniel sat alone in the bay again. He looked at the folder in front of him. He thought about the 2 servicemen who had gone down in that helicopter 3 months ago. He thought about one of them in particular, a man named Specialist Carlos Reyes, whose wife had been told by an official representative that the accident had been caused by unexpected component fatigue, a finding consistent with the operational age of the aircraft, and that the command deeply regretted the incident. Reyes had 2 kids. His wife's name was Angela. She had called the investigators twice, asking follow-up questions, and been told both times that the case was closed. Daniel thought about Angela Reyes reading a form letter that had been designed to be technically true and emotionally sufficient and systematically false, and he felt something move through him that was not anger and was not grief, but was close to both the particular feeling of a man who understands what accountability is actually for. Not punishment, not institutional self-protection, not the satisfaction of seeing the guilty face consequences. Those things mattered, but they weren't the point. The point was that Angela Reyes deserved the truth. The point was that the 2 men who had been injured deserved the truth. The point was that the next group of sailors who strapped into equipment at this base deserved the truth. The real truth, not the version that fit the readiness report. That was why he was here. That was what the flash drive was for. That was what Murdoch's log and Hartman's statement and Bennett's 7 months of copied documents were for. Not to destroy Vance. Not to humiliate Rourke. Not to collect scalps. To make it so that the next thing that broke in a room where someone was required to say so out loud. He went back to his notes. At 3:15 p.m., his phone rang. Not Mia. Not Chen. A number he recognized as belonging to a man named General Arthur Whitfield. One of the 4 commission principals calling from a number that was not his official line, which meant this was a personal call and not a formal one. Daniel, Whitfield said. General. You're on schedule. On schedule. Vance's people have been making some calls. There's some pressure coming from his Hill contacts. I expected that, Daniel said. It won't affect the review, Whitfield said. I want you to hear that from me directly. I know. A pause. How's it look? Daniel thought about Murdoch's folded paper. Hartman's statement. Bennett's flash drive. The inspection board with 43 green tags. The conversation he'd had with Rourke that morning. The way Rourke had said, my team respects you. The way Mia had said he decides what matters most and then shows up for it. It looks like a system that forgot what it was for, Daniel said. And some people who remembered. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. See you Friday, he said. Yes, sir, Daniel said. He ended the call. He sat with the silence for a beat. Then he looked at his watch. 3:22 p.m. 40 hours and 38 minutes until 0800 Friday. He picked up his pen, opened his notebook, and kept working. Because the story he had spent 3 days building out of maintenance logs and personal courage and quiet conversations in maintenance bays and documentation rooms had to be told correctly, completely, irrefutably, not as an accusation, but as a record, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. And because 2 families in North Carolina were waiting for someone to tell them the truth, he was going to give it to them. Every word of it. Outside the base went on with its afternoon exercises, running aircraft moving personnel, rotating through their cycles. Most of them had no idea what was coming on Friday morning. Most of them were doing their jobs well in the way that most people in any institution do their jobs, with competence and commitment, and the reasonable expectation that the system they were part of was fundamentally sound. Some of them, though, were moving differently today than they had on Monday. A little more carefully. A little more honestly. As if something had shifted underneath the normal weight of things, and they could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. In Training Area 4, the damaged harness had been pulled from service. A yellow tag had replaced the green one on the inspection board, and Noah Bennett, signing off on an equipment log, at the end of his shift, wrote down exactly what he saw, exactly as it was, and signed his name under it without hesitation. That was new. That was what the next 40 hours were about. Thursday night came in cold off the coast, and Daniel Cross sat at the kitchen table in the house outside Wilmington and did not sleep. I wasn't anxious. That was the thing people misunderstood about men who had operated in the environments. He had operated in the stillness they carried, wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the presence of discipline. The ability to acknowledge every variable, every risk, every possible failure point, and then set all of it aside and focus on the one thing that needed doing next. He had learned that quality over years, in places he would never describe to anyone at this table, in circumstances that had required him to be the calmest person in a room where other people were dying. He had never lost that quality. He suspected he never would. What he was sitting at that kitchen table at 11:47 p.m., with his notebook open, and his second cup of coffee cooling beside it, was ready. The commission opened in 8 hours and 13 minutes. He reviewed his materials one final time. Not because he needed to, the shape of the investigation was clear in his mind, sequenced and sourced and documented at every critical juncture. He reviewed them because thoroughness was respect, because the 2 men who had gone down in that helicopter, and the families who had been handed a careful lie, deserved someone who had checked his work twice. He closed the notebook at 12:20 a.m. He washed his cup. He went to check on Mia. She was asleep on her side with one arm over the edge of the mattress, her hand curled loosely in the way she'd slept since she was a baby. Her nightlight threw a soft amber light across the room. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment long enough to let the image settle somewhere permanent in him, the way certain things do when you know that tomorrow will require everything you have. He said goodnight quietly, even though she couldn't hear it. Then he went to bed. He was up at 5:30 a.m. Hi, Maud. Breakfast, eggs and toast. Nothing remarkable. The same breakfast he made every Thursday, because Mia had decided at some point in the last year that eggs on Thursdays were tradition, and he had not argued with her. She came down at 6:15 in her school clothes with her hair not quite done and a question already forming on her face. "Are you nervous?" she asked. He slid eggs onto her plate. No. She considered this with the same evaluating expression her mother had used. "You made the eggs first instead of the toast first," she said. "You always do the toast first." He looked at the plate. She was correct. "A little," he admitted. She picked up her fork. "It'll be okay," she said with the absolute unqualified certainty of someone who has never had a reason to doubt her father. "You always do the right thing." The simplicity of it hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He sat across from her and ate his breakfast. He drove her to school at 7:40 a.m. She got out, took her backpack, turned back to the window. "Tell me tonight," she said. He said he would. She walked into the building without looking back, which was new, which meant she was growing up, which was the best and hardest thing he knew. He drove to the base. It was 07:12 when he cleared the gate. The guard processed him faster than Monday, not because protocol had loosened, but because the record that had come back confusing and full of restricted fields on Monday had now been annotated by the Commission's Washington office, and whatever annotation it carried changed the tempo of the transaction entirely. The young petty officer at the desk handled it with practiced professionalism and said good morning with the specific quality of someone who has been briefed that this morning is not a standard morning. The base knew something was happening, not the details. But the texture of a place changes when something significant is approaching, and everyone who worked there daily could feel the change, even if they couldn't name it. Conversations were shorter. People were at their stations earlier. The administrative wing had lights on that were normally dark until 0800. Daniel walked through it all and noted everything with his peripheral attention, while his primary focus stayed on what came next. He had 48 minutes before the commission convened. He used them carefully. At 07:08, he stopped at the operations bay and confirmed that Bennett and Murdoch had both received formal notification of their interview times. Bennett at 09:30, Murdoch at 1100. Both had acknowledged. Daniel had arranged for a commission counsel to be present for both, partly for legal completeness and partly because both men deserved someone in that room whose job was explicitly to protect them. At 0731, he confirmed with Margaret Chen by text that the four principals had arrived at the regional airfield at 0643 and were 20 minutes out by convoy. She added without his asking, Vance's Hill contact called the Undersecretary's office last night. Was told to stand down. Vance knows. He's going to be difficult this morning. Daniel texted back. Noted. At 0744, Blake Rourke found him in the corridor outside the main operations center. Rourke was in full uniform, which was standard for a Friday on base, but the uniform sat differently on him this morning. The same clothes, the same rank insignia, but worn with less performance in them than Daniel had seen all week. He looked like a man who had decided to stop using the uniform as armor and was now just wearing it as a uniform. I pulled the full rope system, Rourke said without preamble. Not just the harness, the whole rig. Had it sent to independent maintenance for assessment. Daniel looked at him. When? Yesterday afternoon, after we talked. He paused. They found 2 additional stress points on the primary attachment system that weren't in any inspection log. Neither of them would have survived a week of active training load. The weight of that sat in the air between them. You documented it, Daniel asked. Filed the full stand-down report at 1700. Sent copies to the maintenance chief, the training coordinator, and the commission's records hold address that was in the briefing. He met Daniel's eyes. I figured if I was going to start doing this right, I should start before anyone told me to. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Not from lack of response, but from the decision about which response to offer. That took integrity, he said finally. Rourke's jaw shifted. It took being ashamed of myself, he said. Which is apparently what I needed. Before Daniel could answer, the sound of engines came from the front of the building. Multiple vehicles. The particular weight of a convoy arriving with the specific unhurried authority of people who don't need to announce themselves. Both men turned toward the sound without thinking. The 4 principals had arrived. At 0801, Daniel was standing in the main operations hangar, a large high-ceilinged space that was used for briefings equipment staging, and on this morning, the formal convening of the Joint Special Operations Readiness Commission review. Tables had been arranged in a U-shape. Commission personnel were setting up documentation stations. The 2 junior analysts, who had been seconded to the review, were organizing the physical evidence packages. Murdoch's log, Hartman's statement, the printed summary of Bennett's flash drive, contents, the maintenance inspection photographs, the chain of decision documentation that traced every flagged safety report from its origin to its disappearance. Captain Richard Vance entered the hangar at 0803. He was in his best uniform, every decoration properly placed, every crease exact, the command bearing of 22 years of service worn like a second skin. He walked to the position that had been designated for command personnel and stood there with the composure of a man who had decided that his best option was to project absolute confidence and dare the room to contradict it. Daniel watched him from across the hangar. Vance was not a coward. That was important to understand. He was a man who had made a series of decisions that prioritized institutional metrics over human safety, and had convinced himself that those decisions were reasonable, pragmatic, even necessary, and had then compounded them by burying the evidence rather than facing the consequences. That was a different thing from cowardice. It was a kind of moral arithmetic that produced monstrous results from individually defensible-seeming calculations, and it was far more common and far more dangerous than simple cowardice because it wore the face of competence. Other personnel filed in. Senior officers, training coordinators, several of Rourke's fellow instructors, enlisted personnel who had been notified of required attendance. The hangar filled with the low sound of people arranging themselves into positions appropriate to their rank, which was what military personnel did by reflex, even when the nature of the event was unclear. Rourke came in and stood with his fellow instructors. Murdoch came in and stood in the enlisted section, and he and Hartman exchanged a brief look, and something passed between them that looked like two men who had made their peace with a hard decision and were no longer second-guessing it. Bennett came in last, nearly late, and took a position near the back. He looked young this morning. He looked exactly as young as he was 24 years old, with a flash drive's worth of institutional courage riding on what happened next. Vance watched all of this from his position and held his face steady. Then the doors at the far end of the hangar opened, and 4 United States generals walked in. They came in without announcement, without ceremony, without the kind of entrance that was designed to impress. They simply walked in with the unhurried confidence of people who understood exactly where they were and what they were there to do. They wore their uniforms the way men wear things they have worn for decades without thinking about them, which is the only way you know something fits completely. The hangar went quiet. Not silently. There was still the ambient sound of the building, the distant equipment, the coastal wind. But the particular quality of conversation and movement that fills a room with people in it simply stopped because everyone present understood instinctively that the room had changed. Vance stepped forward. He was 3 steps into his movement toward the generals when it became clear that they were not moving toward him. He took a 4th step and stopped, because the 4 generals in formation, walking with the quiet certainty of people who knew precisely where they were going, were walking directly past him. Not around him, past him. Not hostile, not theatrical. Simply directed, as if his position in the room was not the position they had come to find. Every eye in the hangar followed them. Rourke watched. Bennett watched. Murdoch watched. Vance stood absolutely still and watched. The 4 generals crossed the hangar floor and stopped directly in front of Daniel Cross, who was standing with his notebook in his hand, and his visitor credential still clipped to his jacket in the same faded jeans he'd been wearing all week, next to the same worn jacket, looking for all the world, like a man who had wandered into the wrong building. And then, in the silence of the hangar, with every uniformed person present watching, all 4 of them saluted him. It was precise. Clean. The full formal military salute held directed at the man in the civilian clothes with the old truck in the parking lot. One of them, General Whitfield, whom Daniel had spoken to Thursday afternoon, said in a voice that carried clearly in the silence, "Mr. Cross, the commission is assembled and ready for your findings, sir." Daniel returned the acknowledgement. He did it without drama, without the satisfaction of looking across the room at Rourke, or at Vance, or at any of the faces that were doing the math right now, recalculating every interaction, every assumption, every judgment made in the past 4 days about the man with the visitor badge and the juice box in the cup holder. He simply said, "Thank you, General. Let's get to work." But Rourke was looking. I was looking with the expression of a man who has been handed a mirror and cannot look away from it. Not because of the power the gesture revealed, though the power was real and the revelation was complete, but because of the contrast between what he was seeing now and what he had said in the training yard on Monday morning. The gap between those 2 moments was not navigable by rationalization. It sat there in the middle of the hangar, clear and exact and permanent. He had looked at this man and made a decision about him in 3 seconds. He had been wrong about every element of that decision, and the worst version of that wrongness, the version that kept surfacing when Rourke tried to think about it clearly, was not that he had underestimated a powerful man. It was that he had treated a person as less than he deserved to be treated because of how that person looked, because of what he wore, and what he drove, and where he sat in the hierarchy of visible rank. And he had done it in front of his team, which meant his team had learned something from watching him do it. He had taught them without intending to that visible power was the condition of respect. He stood there in the hangar and understood for the first time without any qualification that he had been wrong. Not just strategically, not just practically, wrong in a way that went deeper than consequences. Vance's composure held for approximately 90 seconds after the salute. Then it didn't. He moved toward the commission table with the urgent, controlled energy of a man who has decided that forward motion is his only remaining option. He addressed Whitfield directly, bypassing the protocol that would have required him to address the civilian chairman first. "General, I want to register my concern about the process by which this review was initiated and the—" "Captain Vance." It was Daniel's voice, quiet, from 8 feet away. "The commission convenes in 4 minutes. If you have procedural objections, they go through commission counsel. She's at the table to your left." Vance turned to look at him. Something happened in Vance's face in that moment. Something that was the last rearrangement of a man who has run out of moves. Not surrender men like Vance didn't surrender cleanly, but the specific expression of a man who has understood fully and finally that the room he is standing in does not belong to him. He went to commission counsel. At 0808, Daniel Cross opened the formal review. He stood at the head of the table and spoke without notes, which was the first thing that set the tone for what followed. He didn't perform. He didn't prosecute. He laid out findings the way a skilled surgeon describes what an examination revealed, clearly, sequentially, without drama, with the understanding that the facts themselves were serious enough not to require embellishment. He began with the helicopter. He walked through the timeline of the tail rotor assembly, finding the original maintenance flag, the chain of reports and responses, the documented decision to classify the wear reading as within operational tolerance, the replacement of Murdoch's maintenance entry, the flight clearance, the crash. He laid each piece next to the one before it, with the care of a man building something that needed to hold weight. When he reached the moment where he cited Murdoch's log directly, he saw Vance's counsel lean close to Vance's ear. He saw Vance give a single small shake of his head. That was the moment where Vance understood that the log existed, that it had been preserved outside the system he'd been cleaning for 48 hours, and that it contained exactly what it contained. He moved to the rope system documentation. The 2 write-ups that had been returned to Murdoch and Hartman with notes clearing the equipment to operational standard. The harness that had been kept in service. The additional stress points that Rourke's independent maintenance assessment had found the previous afternoon. He presented Rourke's voluntary stand-down report without comment, because the document spoke for itself, and because he had said to Rourke what needed saying and had no interest in adding to it publicly. He presented Bennett's documentation last. 7 months of maintenance logs, emails with attachments, training incident reports that didn't match the official summaries. The pattern they revealed, the systematic relationship between the quarterly readiness reporting cycle and the timing of safety concern dismissals, was in the aggregate impossible to read as coincidence. The hangar was completely still. When he finished presenting, he closed the folder in front of him and looked at the commission principals. The injury to Specialist Reyes and Corporal Thies, he said, was not the result of unexpected component fatigue. It was the result of a documented maintenance concern that was administratively suppressed to protect a readiness reporting metric. The responsibility for that suppression and the decision-making that led to it is traceable and documented. He paused. The commission has what it needs to make its determinations. Whitfield said, "Thank you, Mr. Cross." That was when Vance stood up. His counsel put a hand on his arm. He shook it off. "I have 22 years of service at installations across 4 commands," he said. His voice was controlled, but it was the control of a structural element under more load than it was designed for. "I have consistently produced the highest readiness metrics in this region. The decisions made at this command were made within the framework of operational necessity and the guidance I received from the reporting chain above me. I reject the characterization that, Captain." General Whitfield's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a door closing. You'll have the opportunity to present your response through the formal process. Please sit down. A long, terrible moment. Vance sat. The hangar breathed again. It was 0947 when the formal session recessed. Daniel stepped away from the table and walked toward the far side of the hangar. He needed 60 seconds with no one in front of him. Not for drama, just to let the morning recalibrate in his body the way you need to after something that requires everything. He heard footsteps behind him. He turned. It was Rourke. They were far enough from the main group that they had a version of privacy. Rourke stopped 4 feet away, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I need to ask you something," Rourke said. "Go ahead." "When you walked into the yard Monday morning, when I said what I said to you," he stopped, worked through it. "Did you know then that it was going to end up here? Did you know what the week was going to look like?" Daniel thought about it honestly. "I knew what I was here to find out. I knew the general shape of what the investigation would show if the reports were accurate." He paused. "I didn't know what you were going to be." "What do you mean?" "I mean I didn't know whether you were the cause of the problem or a product of it." Daniel held his gaze. "That mattered to me. It makes a difference." Rourke absorbed that. "Which was I?" "Product," Daniel said, with enough self-awareness to become something else. A long silence. "What happens to me?" Rourke asked. The question was quiet, not begging, just a man asking a real question because he needed to know. "You'll face a formal review of the training incidents documented in the record. The voluntary stand-down you filed yesterday will be noted. Your cooperation will be noted." Daniel looked at him steadily. "You're a good officer who has been operating inside a broken system and absorbing its values as if they were his own. That's not a death sentence. It's a diagnosis." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "The thing I said to you on Monday morning," he said. "Yeah, I've been a SEAL for 7 years. I've said some version of that to a lot of people." He looked at his hands. "I said it to people who couldn't say anything back, who had no rank to invoke no authority to protect themselves." He looked up. "I was more careful about who I said it to than I thought. I was saying it to the people I knew wouldn't cost me anything." Daniel let him sit with that. "That's the thing Holloway was trying to tell you," Daniel said. "I know," Rourke said. "I just needed to hear it from you." Before Daniel could respond, Bennett appeared at the edge of the space, approaching with the careful, permission-seeking energy of someone who wasn't sure if he belonged in the conversation. Daniel gestured him forward. Bennett looked between the two men, clearly uncertain of the geometry. Then he looked at Daniel. "The Commission Council needs your signature on the evidence chain documentation," he said. "And," he stopped. "And," Daniel said. "And Specialist Rhea's wife is on the phone," Bennett said. "She heard about the review from, I don't know how she heard, but she heard. She wants to know if someone can talk to her, today." He swallowed. "She just wants to know what actually happened to her husband." Daniel was already moving. He crossed the hangar in 20 seconds, took the phone from the Commission's communications officer, and walked out through the side door into the cold morning air. The call lasted 31 minutes. He did not record it. He did not take notes. He just talked to Angela Reyes, who was 31 years old and had 2 children, ages 4 and 6, and who had spent 3 months being told in official language that what had happened to her husband was nobody's fault and the case was closed. He told her the truth. All of it. He told her that the investigation had been reopened, that the crash was not the result of random component failure, that her husband and Corporal Thies had been put in an aircraft that the maintenance record showed should not have been cleared for flight. He told her that the Commission's findings would be formal and documented, and that the command responsible for those decisions would face appropriate consequences. She was silent for a long time after. Then she said, I knew that what they told me wasn't right. I didn't have anything to point to." "You do now," Daniel said. She cried for a few minutes, which he allowed because it was real and it was appropriate, and the only thing to do with real grief is let it be there. When she was done, she said, "Thank you for telling me the truth." He said, "I'm sorry it took this long." He ended the call and stood in the cold air for a moment. The base was running its regular Friday schedule around the edges of what was happening in the hangar. Vehicles moving, personnel rotating, the machinery of the installation going on, because it always did, because that was the nature of institutions. They continued regardless of what was happening in any individual room. But in Training Area 4, the rope system was tagged out for full maintenance assessment. And in the administrative wing, an officer was logging a formal safety concern under the new anonymous reporting protocol that hadn't existed 48 hours ago. And in the main hangar, a commission was preparing its findings. And somewhere across the country, Angela Reyes was sitting with a truth she had waited 3 months for. Daniel walked back inside. He had more work to do. At 1:15 p.m., the commission formally presented its preliminary findings to the command, and Richard Vance was informed that he was being relieved of command, pending a full investigation. He received the notification standing with his counsel beside him and his hands at his sides, and he said nothing, which was the most dignified thing he had done all week. 3 senior officers were notified of pending reviews. The maintenance documentation case was referred to a separate investigative body. The helicopter crash investigation was formally reopened. At 2:30 p.m., Daniel sat at the commission table and signed the findings package, which was 83 pages long and had 4 years of institutional consequences embedded in its language. He signed it the way he'd written everything this week, steadily, without ceremony, because the work was the thing, not the performance of the work. He handed it to Whitfield. Whitfield looked at it, looked at Daniel. "Good work," he said. "Thank the people who talked," Daniel said. "I just carried it." At 3:17 p.m., he walked out of the hangar. The convoy was preparing to move. Commission personnel were packing documentation. The base was digesting what had happened the way large institutions always digest accountability, slowly, imperfectly, with significant amounts of institutional inertia pushing back against every inch of change. But change was in the record now. It was signed. It was documented. It was real in the way that only things committed to formal record are real, which was the only kind of real that protected the people who needed protecting. He reached his truck. He sat behind the wheel. He thought about Monday morning. The same truck, the same lot, the visitor badge, the visitor he'd been pretending to be. He thought about 8:43 a.m. and a damaged harness and a voice that had said, "What rank are you, asshole?" He thought about the answer he'd given. "No rank you need to worry about." He almost smiled. His phone buzzed. Mia. "Is it over?" she asked. "Yeah, sweetheart, it's over." "Did you do the right thing?" He looked through this windshield at the base, at the gate, at the institutional machinery of it all, continuing to run in the complicated, imperfect way it ran. "I think we got a little closer to it," he said. She was quiet for a second. Then, "Are you coming home?" He started the engine. "Already on my way," he said. The drive home took 47 minutes. Daniel didn't listen to the radio. He didn't make calls. He just drove with both hands on the wheel and the late afternoon light coming through the windshield. And he let the week decompress the way it needed to. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the way pressure releases when you finally allow it to. The steady bleeding off of accumulated weight. The return from the place where everything mattered at maximum intensity back to the ordinary world, where a man drove a truck home to make dinner for his daughter. The juice box was still in the cup holder. He noticed that and felt something so simple and so complete that he couldn't have named it if anyone had asked. Mia had leftover pasta ready when he walked in, which meant she had heated it herself, using the instructions he had taped to the inside of the cabinet door when she was 8, which meant she was proud of herself and wanted him to notice. He noticed. He told her the pasta was perfect, which it wasn't quite, but the effort behind it was, and that was the thing worth acknowledging. She talked through dinner about a disagreement at school, about a book she was reading about whether the youth baseball season would start before or after spring break. He listened to all of it. He asked questions. He refilled her glass without being asked. How was completely present. That was the discipline nobody talked about. Not the classified missions, not the operational training, not the decade of high-stakes decisions in environments that had no margin for error. The discipline of coming home and being home. of leaving the weight of the day in the truck where it belonged and walking through the door as a father, not as whatever he had been for the past 5 days. He had learned that discipline the hard way through the years when he hadn't quite managed it, when he had come home still carrying everything, and given Mia the leftover version of himself, and had watched her small face absorb his distraction with the uncomplaining adaptability of children who understand instinctively that their parents are fallible and love them anyway. I didn't do that anymore. Tonight, he was completely there at that table with the slightly overdone pasta and his daughter's voice filling the kitchen. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the thing. Later, after dishes and homework and the nightly negotiation over screen time that he always lost by exactly 15 minutes, he sat on the edge of Mia's bed while she settled in, and she asked him the question he'd been waiting for all evening. So what actually happened today? I thought about how to answer that in the terms available to a 10-year-old without being condescending about it, which was always the calibration challenge with her. Some people got hurt, he said, about 3 months ago, because some other people made bad decisions and then tried to cover up that they'd made them. Did the bad people get in trouble? They will, he said. Yes. She absorbed this. Did you get in trouble? No. Good. She pulled her blanket up. Were you scared? He thought about it honestly. There were moments, he said. Not of the physical kind, more the kind where you're not sure if what you're doing is going to work or if the people who need to be brave are going to be brave. Were they? He thought about Murdoch with the folded paper he'd been carrying for 3 months. Hartman walking out of Vance's office with his jaw set. Bennett setting a flash drive on a table with steady hands. Yeah, he said. They were. She looked at him with the particular evaluating expression that always reminded him of her mother. Were you the most important person there? He smiled. No. Then who was? The people who were afraid, he said, and showed up anyway. She thought about that. Then she nodded the way she nodded when something made sense on a level she wasn't going to argue with. Good night, Dad. Good night, sweetheart. He turned off the light. He sat at the kitchen table for another hour, not working, just sitting with the quiet of the house. Then he went to bed, and for the first time all week, he slept without the notebook. The Commission's preliminary findings went public in the specific controlled way that classified joint investigations go public 11 days later. The announcement was institutional and precise: Joint Maritime Warfare Center Command Structure, under review following safety compliance investigation. Independent assessment of training protocols and maintenance certification procedures, ordered across 3 regional commands. New anonymous reporting framework established effective immediately. It was not front-page news. It never was with things like this. The machinery of accountability in these institutions moved in the language of internal memos and formal reviews and reassignment notices, not in press conferences. But within the world, where it mattered, within the network of people who wore the uniform or had worn it, who knew what the words meant and could read between them, the announcement landed with significant weight. Richard Vance was formally relieved of command on a Tuesday. The ceremony involved no ceremony at all, which was its own statement. He was escorted from the installation by his XO, which was the same man who had hovered near the door during Vance's confrontation with Daniel on Thursday, and who had looked away when Vance tried to make eye contact at the moment of departure. Vance's formal investigation would take months. The outcome of it was not something Daniel permitted himself to predict, because he had been in this work long enough to know that institutional accountability was real but imperfect, and that the gap between what should happen and what did happen was where careers in oversight were made or broken. He had done what he could do. He filed his final report 2 weeks after the review, 89 pages this time, with 4 appendices and a separate recommendations section that outlined specific structural changes to the readiness reporting framework changes, designed not to punish commanders for having problems, but to make it impossible to hide them. He submitted it, received formal acknowledgement from the Commission, and returned to the ordinary life that existed on the other side of Joint Maritime Warfare Center. Youth baseball, school pickup, bad pancakes on Saturday mornings, the F-150 that knocked once when it started, and then settled, the purple hair tie on the gear shift. He didn't talk about what had happened. There was nobody to tell who didn't already know the professional version and the personal version, the particular texture of the week. Mia's presentation, the gymnasium, the good night, he'd said. Through a closed door at midnight was not something he needed to process out loud. He carried it in the way that people carry the weeks that clarify something important about who they are. 6 months passed. I was coaching third base during a Saturday morning youth baseball game, wearing a hat that said, "Coaches on the front," in letters that had faded to barely legible, when his phone buzzed with a number he recognized as the Joint Maritime Warfare Center administrative line. He let it go to voicemail. The runner on second needed his full attention. He called back during the water break between innings. The voice on the other end was a young administrative specialist. He didn't recognize who said that the base had organized a small recognition event in conjunction with the implementation of the new safety reporting framework, and that certain individuals had been specifically requested by name by personnel currently assigned to the installation, and that Mr. Cross's attendance would be appreciated if his schedule allowed. He asked who had made the request. The specialist said, "Petty Officer First Class Bennett, sir. He's been selected to speak at the event. He specifically asked if you could be there." Daniel looked at the field. The water break was ending. Kids were picking up their gloves. "I'll be there," he said. He arrived at Joint Maritime Warfare Center on a Thursday morning, 6 months after the week that had started with a knock in his truck engine and ended with 4 generals in a hangar. He drove the same truck. He wore the same kind of clothes. He had his visitor credential updated reissued clipped to his jacket in the same position. The gate was staffed by a different petty officer than the young man from that first Monday. This one processed his entry without any of the subtle recalibrations that had characterized his arrivals during the investigation week. The record that came back was what it was. Restricted fields, blank pages, clearance levels that didn't match a visitor badge, and the young man simply processed it with professional efficiency and said good morning. The base felt different. Daniel had been in enough institutions at different points in their life cycles to read the texture of a place accurately, and the texture of Joint Maritime Warfare Center. On this Thursday morning was different from what it had been 6 months ago. Not transformed institutions don't transform, they evolve slowly and imperfectly, with significant friction and backsliding, and the constant competing pressure of the things that made them comfortable in the first place. But different, measurably. He noticed it in the small things. An equipment stand-down notice posted in the operations corridor that wasn't apologetic about the impact on readiness numbers. It was factual signed, dated with a clear resolution timeline. A group of junior sailors in conversation with a chief who was listening more than talking. A maintenance log on the wall near the secondary bay that had 2 yellow tags and 1 red, which meant things that were actually yellow and red were being logged as yellow and red rather than as green. Small things. The ones that mattered. Noah Bennett found him before the event started in the corridor outside the main briefing room, and for a moment they just stood there in the way that people stand when too much has passed between them for a normal greeting to contain it. Bennett looked different. Not older exactly 6 months wasn't enough for that, but more settled in himself. The quality of suppressed alertness that had characterized him in that first maintenance bay conversation had become something else. Not the absence of alertness, the absence of the suppression. "You came," Bennett said. "Of course," Daniel said. "I wasn't sure you would." He paused. "I mean, I asked, but I wasn't." "Bennett," Daniel said. "I told you I'd carry it after you handed it to me. I meant that in both directions." Something in Bennett's face relaxed. "How are you?" Daniel asked. "Good," Bennett said, and it had the ring of something true rather than something performed. "I'm in the Advanced Leadership Program, started in January." He paused. "Senior Chief Murdoch wrote my recommendation." Daniel felt something warm move through him at that. "The new reporting framework," Bennett continued. It's not perfect. People are still figuring out how to use it. Some of the senior NCOs are still adjusting to a world where junior personnel can file concerns without it automatically getting read as insubordination." He tilted his head. "But 3 things have been filed in the past 6 weeks that would never have been filed before." One of them was a maintenance issue that the assessment team said could have caused a serious injury within 30 days. 3 things caught, Daniel said. 3 things caught, Bennett agreed. The weight of that was not small. 3 reports that would have been buried 6 months ago. 3 potential injuries that hadn't happened. 3 moments where the system had worked the way it was supposed to work, where someone had said out loud what they saw, and the institution had responded to it rather than suppressing it. That was what 89 pages of commission findings were actually for. "Are you nervous about speaking?" Daniel asked. Bennett made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes, completely." He straightened slightly. "But Senior Chief Murdoch told me something when I was prepping. He said the most important thing about speaking in front of people who need to hear something is that you say it clearly, not impressively. Clearly." "Murdoch's right," Daniel said. "He usually is," Bennett said. "Which is annoying because he's also not great at admitting when he's wrong about the small stuff." Daniel actually laughed at that. Then the door opened, and the administrative specialist from the phone call appeared and said the event was starting in 7 minutes, and Bennett straightened, and they walked in together. The briefing room held about 60 people. A mix of ranks, a mix of assignments, the specific cross-section of an installation that you got when an event was genuinely installation-wide rather than rank-specific. Junior enlisted near NCOs in the middle section, officers toward the front. The natural gravitational arrangement of military rank that happened without direction. And sitting in the 3rd row, not far from the middle, was Blake Rourke. Daniel saw him immediately. Rourke was not in his SEAL instructor role today. He was dressed in the working uniform of his current assignment, the training command position he'd been moved to during his formal disciplinary review, which was still ongoing. He was sitting straight, looking forward with the particular quality of a man who is attending something he didn't have to attend and chose to anyway. Daniel took a seat near the back off to the side, the way he always did in rooms like this, positioned to see the whole room without occupying a prominent position in it. Murdoch was on the small stage, serving as the event's organizing senior NCO. He saw Daniel come in and gave him the nod, brief, precise, the acknowledgement of a man who communicated efficiently. Hartman was in the 2nd row. He caught Daniel's eye and gave a small lift of his chin. The new base commander, a captain named Elise Torres, who had been assigned in the wake of Vance's relief and whose reputation Daniel had checked thoroughly before the appointment was finalized, opened the event with remarks that were direct and without the particular brand of self-congratulation that these institutional reform events often produced. She talked about the framework. She talked about what it was designed to do. She talked about what it would require from everyone in the room, not just junior personnel filing reports, but senior leaders creating the conditions where filing a report was genuinely safe. She said the word accountability without flinching, which was notable. She said, "Our readiness numbers should reflect reality. If they don't, the numbers are wrong, not the reality. And a wrong number that looks right is the most dangerous number there is." It was the right thing to say, in exactly the right way. Then Bennett stood up. He walked to the front with the same careful dignity that Mia had carried into her school gymnasium 6 months ago, and Daniel recognized it for what it was, the composure of someone who is afraid and has decided that what they're about to do matters more than the fear. Bennett spoke for 11 minutes. He didn't talk about the flash drive. He didn't talk about Daniel by name. He didn't frame it as a story of whistleblowing or institutional failure or personal courage, though it was all of those things. He talked about the morning he had almost let Noah Bennett stay quiet. About the decision, the specific concrete first-person decision to say something rather than nothing. About what it had cost him in the short term and what it had meant in the longer one. About the 2 men who had been injured in the helicopter and what it felt like to know that their injuries were preventable, and what it felt like to know that now going forward, there was a mechanism in place that hadn't existed before. He said, "The hardest thing wasn't being afraid. I was going to be afraid no matter what. The hardest thing was deciding whether being afraid was a good enough reason to stay quiet when people were getting hurt." The room was completely still. He said, "It isn't." He stepped back. The room applauded, and in the applause, Daniel heard something genuine. Not the obligatory reflexive applause of military events, but the sound of people responding to something they recognized as real. Howe was still processing that when Rourke stood up. Not to speak, there was no program slot for Rourke. He simply stood, and when people turned to look at him, he started clapping specifically and deliberately facing the direction where Bennett was standing. It lasted for maybe 5 seconds before it was absorbed into the general applause. But it was particular. It was aimed. And in a room where rank and its implications were visible to everyone present, a SEAL lieutenant making that specific gesture toward a petty officer first class carried weight that everyone in the room understood. The event ended at 10:40 a.m. People dispersed the way they do after institutional events, some quickly, some with the small clusters of follow-up conversation that meant the content had landed and people wanted to keep talking about it. Murdoch was approached by a group of junior sailors that he handled with the particular efficiency of a man who had spent 22 years figuring out how to transfer understanding from his head to other people's heads in the least possible time. Daniel was heading for the door when Rourke stepped into his path. Not blocking, just arriving. They stood in the thinning crowd of the briefing room, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had said the important things and were deciding what if anything came next. "I've been thinking," Rourke said, "about what I said to you the first morning." "You've said that before," Daniel said. "I keep thinking about it," Rourke said. "I think I'm going to keep thinking about it for a while." He paused. "I want to apologize, properly. Not because of who you turned out to be, because of who you were when I said it." Daniel looked at him. "You were a person," Rourke said, "standing at a fence, telling me something true, and I used my rank as a reason not to hear you." He met Daniel's eyes. "That's what I'm apologizing for." There it was. Not the apology that said, "I'm sorry I didn't know you were important." The apology that said, "I'm sorry I treated you as though importance was the condition of respect." That was a different apology. A harder one. The kind that required a person to understand what they'd actually done, rather than just the consequences of it. Daniel extended his hand. Rourke took it. They shook hands in the emptying briefing room, and it wasn't a ceremony, and it wasn't a resolution of everything between them, because some things don't resolve cleanly. They just reach a point where two people understand each other well enough to move forward. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. "What happens with your review?" Daniel asked. "Formal board meets next month," Rourke said. "My counsel thinks I'll retain my commission. Modified duties for another 6 months minimum, probably. Operational command review after that." "And if you get it back?" Daniel asked. Rourke was quiet for a moment. "Then I run my team the way I should have been running it," he said. "Where the mission is the thing, not the metrics." He paused. "Where Bennett gets to speak." Daniel nodded. "Can I ask you something?" Rourke said. "Go ahead." "Your record, the blank pages, the restricted fields." He stopped. "I'm not asking what's in them. I know I don't have that clearance, and I probably never will." He looked at Daniel steadily. "I'm asking, was it worth it, all of it, whatever it was?" Daniel thought about the question in the way he thought about questions that deserved real answers. He thought about the places he had been, the things he had done in them, the years when the mission had been the whole world and everything else had been peripheral to it. He thought about the hospital corridor and the drive home and the 5-year-old who had asked him where Mommy was. He thought about the morning he had looked at what his life had become and understood clearly, and finally, what it was actually for. He thought about Sunday mornings at the kitchen table, math worksheets and laughing, a photograph on a poster board at a school gymnasium, the highest rank he had ever held. Different parts of it were worth different things, he said. The part I'm living now is the best part. Rourke absorbed that. Then Daniel said, "Take care of your people, Lieutenant, not their metrics, them." "Yes, sir," Rourke said. It was the first time Rourke had used that address. He hadn't used it during the investigation. He hadn't used it after the salute. He hadn't used it in any of the conversations that had moved between hostility and reckoning and something closer to mutual understanding over the course of a complicated week. He used it now quietly in an emptying briefing room as one man to another, with all the performance stripped away. Daniel accepted it with a nod and walked out. He found Bennett in the corridor, talking to two junior sailors who were asking him questions with the energy of people who had heard something they wanted to understand better. He was answering them with the particular patience of someone who has recently figured out that patience in this direction, toward people with less experience, less rank, less context, is not weakness, but craft. Daniel caught his eye and gave a small nod toward the door. Bennett nodded back. He finished. The conversation shook both of their hands, which made them visibly surprised and then pleased, and fell into step beside Daniel as they walked toward the building exit. "How'd it feel?" Daniel asked. "Terrifying," Bennett said. "Good." He thought about it. "Mostly good." "That ratio improves," Daniel said. "Does the terrifying part go away?" "No," Daniel said. "But you stop needing it to." Bennett considered that for a few steps. "I got my first evaluation under the new commander last week," he said. "Torres." He paused. "She wrote demonstrates integrity under institutional pressure. I've never seen that phrase in an evaluation before." "How'd it feel?" "Like something I actually earned," Bennett said. They pushed through the main door into the late morning air. Murdoch was outside standing with Hartman and a coffee cup, and the two of them made a picture that 6 months ago would have been impossible to imagine, not because they hadn't known each other, but because 6 months ago, they had each been carrying something alone that they are now carrying together. The weight is the same. The carrying is different. Murdoch looked at Daniel. "You don't have to be back for a while," he asked. "Got some time," Daniel said. "Coffee's inside," Murdoch said. "It's bad, but it's hot." Daniel got coffee. They stood outside for 20 minutes. Murdoch, Hartman, Bennett, Daniel, and talked about baseball of all things, because Hartman had a son in Little League and wanted advice about what to do when the kid was having trouble with his swing, and Daniel gave him 3 specific things to try at practice, and Hartman wrote them down in his phone, and the conversation was entirely ordinary and entirely human, and contained within it in some form that couldn't be directly stated everything that the past 6 months had been about. At 11:47 a.m., Daniel said goodbye. Murdoch shook his hand without anything extra in it, which was the right amount. Hartman said thanks genuinely for the baseball advice and for the other thing in that order. Bennett walked him to the parking lot. At the truck he stopped. "What's next for you?" Daniel asked. "Leadership program through March," Bennett said. "Then I've requested a transfer to the oversight support team, the one that works with the new reporting framework at the regional level." He paused. "I want to help other people do what I did. Make it easier for them than it was for me." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "That's the right call," he said. "I thought you'd say that." "Don't let it get to your head," Daniel said. Bennett grinned. Too late. Daniel got in the truck. The engine knocked once and settled. The purple hair tie was still on the gear shift, a different one, Mia's current favorite, which she had left there last week, and he had not returned because there was something about its presence that he found grounding in a way he had never tried to explain to anyone. He pulled out of the lot. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He drove toward the gate, and the gate guard processed his exit with the same professional efficiency as his entry, and he pulled onto the highway and headed toward Wilmington, toward the school where Mia was in the middle of her Thursday, and did not know yet that her father had been at the base, or what had happened there, or what any of it meant. She would ask tonight. She always asked. I was thinking about how to answer when his phone rang through the truck's speaker. The name on the screen was Margaret Chen. He answered. "Heard the event went well," she said. "It did," he said. "Commission is moving to implement 3 of the 5 framework recommendations at the other regional installations. The 4th is under review. The 5th is complicated politically, but we think it gets there by end of year." "Good," he said. "There's another assignment," she said. "When you're ready, different installation, some of the same patterns, metrics, pressure documentation, irregularities. Nothing confirmed yet, but the early reports are concerning." He drove for a moment without answering. "Daniel," she said, "you don't have to take it." "I know," he said. "There are other people who can Margaret." His voice was quiet. "Send me what you have." A pause. "You sure?" He thought about Murdoch's folded paper and 3 months of carrying something alone. He thought about Angela Reyes and a phone call that had lasted 31 minutes. He thought about 3 safety reports filed in 6 weeks at an installation that had filed 0 the year before. He thought about the gap between the thing an institution claims to be and what it actually is, and the people inside it who know the difference and are waiting for someone with the authority and the will to do something about it. He thought about what it cost to stay quiet when it mattered. "Send me what you have," he said again. "Okay," she said. "I'll have it to you by Monday." She hung up. He drove the rest of the way home in silence. He picked Mia up from school at 3:15. She came out the door with her backpack bouncing and a story already forming in her expression. Something that had happened in science class. Something about a lab experiment that had gone differently than expected, which she described in such detail and with such animation for the first 10 minutes of the drive that he barely needed to say anything. He listened. He was completely there. At a red light, she paused her story and looked at him. "Dad." "Yeah." "What rank were you like actually? I know you say you don't like to talk about it, but—" She tilted her head. "I'm curious." He looked at her. He thought about blank pages and restricted fields. He thought about 4 generals in a hangar. He thought about commands and citations and classifications and all the invisible architecture of a career that had taken him to places and decisions that most people would never be cleared to know about. He thought about Sunday mornings at a kitchen table. The light turned green. "These days," he said. He reached over and squeezed her hand once. "Dad," he said, "that's my rank." She looked at him for a second. Then she rolled her eyes in the way that 10-year-olds roll their eyes when something is both completely sentimental and entirely true. "That's so cheesy," she said. "Highest rank I've ever held," he said. She laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that had been cutting through him since she was 3 years old, and turned back to her window and went on with her story about the science experiment. He drove. The road stretched out ahead of them, ordinary and clear toward the house, and the knock in the engine, and the bad pancakes on Saturday morning, and all the small, unglamorous, irreplaceable work of being the person someone needs you to be every single day. Not because the mission is over, because this is the mission. The one that doesn't end. The one that never appears in any classified record on any restricted page, under any clearance level, in any file, anywhere in Washington. The one that mattered most. He drove his daughter home, and that was